And moving right along in Campbell's Masks of God series, Volume 1, I want to now look at Chapter 3, which is really dense with a lot of dates in archaeology. Unfortunately, since this is 1959, a lot of these don't really hold up anymore. So I'm going to do a little revised summary here to guide really through this chapter and what we will be talking about with these different peoples. So essentially, it's called the Proto-Neolithic from 7500 BC to 5500 BC is now the Mesolithic, and as we'll get into, the Natufians and their discovery of agriculture in 2500 BC to 10,000 BC. What he refers to as the Basal Neolithic is now divided into two different structures of pre-pottery Neolithic A, which is about 10,000 BC to 8,700, and then pre-pottery Neolithic B, which resumes to 6,500 BC. And, during these times, as we'll get into, he has noticed how there's difference in the architecture of these civilizations. You go from these circular rooms to then the difference in transformations in the goddesses. Of course, this is comparative mythology. And then we will see how you start establishing rooms and you get the rectangular. You have the high Neolithic period from 4500 BC to 3500 BC, which is now guarded as the pottery Neolithic from 6500 BC to 5200 BC. And you have this sort of polarity or a rivalry, if you would like, of this high achievements in pottery. And so you have this contrast between the beautiful pottery between the Halafian people and the Samarians, who eventually become the Sumerians. So there's a distinction there between the two. And some of the contrasts are the differences between the goddesses. The Halafians are this sort of conservative, and we'll get into the prospects of their burials as compared to the innovators of the Samarians. The Halafians have the fat, plump, and even headless goddesses, where the Samarians come in as the innovators and they change to this slender figure. And of course you have the rectangular, and then they put on these lizard heads onto their goddess figurines. And subtly, out of that innovation, they no longer bury the dead underneath as the Halafians did, and now they shift the dead somewhere else. They can no longer integrate themselves into the prospects of the lived world, and with that, the sort of reverence that we had seen in the Halafians is done away with in prospects of innovation, and we'll get into that more as the chapter progresses here. And so as Campbell does, moving backwards from the Proto-Neolithic, which is now the Mesolithic, the 2700 BC date to 10,000 BC, with the rise in the Natufians and the creation of agriculture. Now prior to this, we have the Eemian interglacial period, which is an ancient epoch of the first modern homo-sapiens, 130,000 years ago to 114,000. And later you have the shift to the Cro-Magnon migrating across Palestine and into Europe. And by about 40,000 BC, you have the modern Homo sapiens that originated in Africa moving to Europe. And then during the Vestjulian Ice Age, 114,000 to 12,000 BC. And interesting enough, this speciation of the hominids happened between these ice ages, such as the Neanderthals 600,000 years ago in the warming period occupying Europe until they become likely extinct by the Cro-Magnon, and then resuming with the Holocene interglacial period of 1200 BC, where we are now. And of course the glaciers melted between 14 to 12,000 BC. The Upper Paleolithic Magdalenians are wiped out stopping caves of its art. It's a sort of dark age, and the animals on the caves starting from 3500 BC are already gone by 1200 BC in the Mesolithic. And then about 10,000 BC, we have the rise of the Natufians all along Palestine and the eastern Mediterranean, where in particular in southern Palestine are the first real houses made of stone in these little miniature igloo-like caves. And then in the north and upper Syria, Abu Huraira being the oldest village that we know of, and it's built in this, again, circular way, and it's, slightly dug down. There's no rooms, of course, and you have this egg-like forms, which is evolving along this gazelle migration route. And then you get started with the beginning of agriculture at 11,500 in Abu Huraira with the domestication of rye. And the Natufians to the south, we see evidence of sickles and barley. And then you really have the basis of village life, transforming really to what will eventually be high civilization. So 12,500 BC to 11,500, the Natufians had these tiny figurines of animals, but had yet to really create a sort of goddess figurine as in this, again, melting sort of epoch, if you will. And then the Natufians, of course, are likely wiped out by a sort of mini ice age between those melting periods, giving rise to the Camayans, dating from about 10,000 BC to 9,500 BC. And that's when we begin to retrieve the goddess figurines in the south, migrating north to Abu Huraira at about 9,500 BC to 9,000 BC. And then you have this new epoch, or the pre-pottery, or Neolithic, if you will, at 10,000 BC, where you have the goddess and agriculture springing up all over the ancient cults of, and you have this creative age where you have the bullhorns god and goddesses, architecture that was once circular proceeds now to the square, or again the rectangular. And this pre-pottery Neolithic B period that we mentioned from 8,700 BC to 6,500 BC is, again, that shift really to the rectilinear room. Rise of the room, you have the start of animal domestication during this pre-pottery Neolithic B time period. Chayanu site is the first real appearance of human sacrifice that we know of, and it's a sort of industry, really. You have special catches of human skulls just stacked up, and the altar, of course, is swathed with human blood. And with that huge industry comes, of course, the notion that blood is what really Mother Nature is dependent on, the sacrifice. So with that, you have the idea of the human being encapsulated within the plant itself, of Mother Earth. And so moving along to Göbekli Tepe in 10,000 BC, beginning of the A period, and Klaus Schmidt excavated in the oldest appearance of monumental architecture, where you have these huge stone circles with pillars and animal totems onto them, and it seemed to be like a sort of seasonal practice to it. Then you have south towards Jericho, 9,000 BC. It is really the first tower made of mud brick at about 28 feet tall, with the staircase of 28 days. The relationship to the moon seems to be a real indicator of that here with the 28 steps. With that, you have the dead, which are buried under the floors of the human habitation. And so with that, you have that relationship of the ancestral dead underneath. And then, of course, they are reanimated with the skull. These cults were using shells and really involving the dead into how they are worshipped, and into really the states of affairs going on in the human habitation. The innovation in the arts of pottery here with the Samarians really suggests that this is the basis for things like the ziggurat and really the foundations of the Samarian cities, where they have this circular notion, they're round, and the ziggurat acts as the center point of the city-state, representing the ascension and its festivities of the ziggurat as the sort of towering structure that leads to the divine. And the idea of the bull god and the double axe seem to have been preserved by the Halafians, and eventually even makes its way down to the foundations of Western civilization itself. Whereas in contrast, again, their competitors, the Samarians, in 3500 BC in southern Mesopotamia, these city-states are built out of mud bricks. And they're always constantly dealing with the floods being, between the Tigris and the Euphrates. And then you have the sister cities of Ur and Uruk. Ur is the city of moon god Nana, seen, whereas Uruk is sacred to Nana and later Gilgamesh. And so you have the association with, the sister cities here of the sun and the moon and their entangled destinies. Each of these ancient city-states, they have their own ruler and revolve around a sort of pole star ziggurat in its association or symbolicism. And that's why in the festivities, civilization is the micro and the macrocosm of heaven on earth. The earth is the mirror, as he says, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. As the world is the microcosm of heaven, and these structures in the greater macrocosm, the principles of truth, of order of the cosmos, and you get that in the Tao or Dharma in India and China, respectively. But in Sumar, you have the Me''Se, and who possesses it is in charge of the ordering of the civilization, which is why Inanna gets Enki drunk and steals the tablets of to be able to be in order of the charging of civilization, who is the god of the mind. And so, in conclusion here to chapter 3, you have a lot of different dates which don't necessarily hold up, but nonetheless the peoples, for the most part, even though it's not necessarily known yet that the Samarians are going to eventually be the Sumerians, which they do. And with that ends this chapter and video, before moving on to the discussions in chapter 4 of the ritual regicide and the spread of its archetype, and how it relates to the relationship to the ancient planters themselves. So yeah, chapter 3 and 4 here are very dense and fascinating chapters in my opinion, and if you guys like these videos, make sure to keep following, liking, commenting, and subscribing. As always, it's appreciated, and I hope to see you guys for the next one.